There you go. Welcome to the Cartographer community meeting. Hope you can find the agenda. Otherwise, I will share it with you all who have joined here live. Remember, the agenda is open for you to add discussion topics. And hopefully today time will be enough for some of the discussions, conversations. Here, you're welcome to ask questions in general there. So let me share my screen. And there you go. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome Kara, Emily, Mori, Sam, Shuma, and everyone else. Welcome here. Okay, we have to move faster with some of the common stuff. So the TLDR, what's new in the project this week, at least from my perspective, one of the new stuff is the .2 and .2.1 release. With several improvements there. So hope you can try it, and we have some bug fixes and new features. Please let us know your feedback, and well, that's interesting. Thank you for making it possible. Okay, yeah, kind of an overview summary, and I know that the project board is there. It's public what the team is working on right now, but I just wanted to know if there was any comment on what's been happening in the project right now, what the team is working on.
A lot of what we're doing right now is all centered around RFCs, which I think we'll get into in plenty detail today. So, yeah.
We're doing it live, right? Cool, that's great. So what's happening here? Moving RFCs, that's it. Cool, from previous meeting, demo work, it's still in progress. We'll be having some sessions in preparation for the TGIK episode, so hopefully that will give us some context for the demo, and also working with an extended team for the CNCF demo. More on that later on. Okay, now open mic discussion, everything, Tanzu TV. Again, a reminder that today we have a live coding episodes from the folks at the developer advocate team from VMware. They will be basically using Cartographer to deploy an application. I don't know to stop this. They will be using Cartographer to deploy an app live. So you're welcome to join, learn there live, and ask questions. It will be automatically recorded also. Cool. Yeah, open. Well, probably you remember the CII Best Practices. It was the Common Infrastructure Initiative from Linux Foundation. Now it was moved to the Open Source Security Foundation. It's basically a baseline of best practices for all open source projects out there, as defined by Linux Foundation. We have Cartographer here. We don't have a passing grade yet, but probably we already have it. The thing is that I don't know it, right? So I just created a couple of issues to be able to track this, because there are two domains there, code analysis and quality, that probably you all could help me confirm if we already are meeting the requirements. The link is there for each one of the requirements on code analysis, for example, and quality. So yeah, if you see quality, for example, there is a question there. If we are using, I don't know, testing, how do we do testing? So probably we are already meeting these requirements. So if you please confirm in the issue, that will be helpful, so I can edit this and start moving this grade to the passing status, right? It's the same for code analysis. Cool, and even in the issues I pointed out to a project who already that already has the passing grade, so you can see how they are responding questions there. Thank you for that. Cool, and now for the continuing the RFC discussions from previous office hours. I was trying to time box the conversations, but I know that each one of these topics has a different, I don't know, different weight. So I will just provide friendly reminders when we are approaching the end of the scheduled time. So let's get started with RFC 9. Any additional point here regarding this RFC?
Yeah, the maintainers had a conversation yesterday discussing RFC 9 and then discussing two different approaches to build on it. RFC 9 allows switching between taking one step and switching between two different templates. And there's a previously existing RFC 5 that proposes snippets that can be used to turn one step into an arbitrary number of templates. A snippet could be one step, but using that snippet, you can have 3, 5, whatever many templates, and there RAS should also come up with a different way to build on what's in RFC 9 to allow one step to pull information from different previous steps, which in the same way allows you to kind of have that accordion-like behavior where you kind of paths through a supply chain defined that aren't the same length. As I said, both of those options add syntax to what's already in RFC 9. Also, RAS should come up with some great suggestions about the syntax for matching. So if you actually go into the Carto repo and hit RFC 9, then go to the text that has been updated based on our conversation yesterday. Yeah. So for example, if you scroll a bit the other way, based on the...
Or if you want to share your screen, it's totally fine.
Sure, give me a second.
Might be helpful if the writers share their screen when we discuss their RFCs.
Happy to do so. So based on the conversation on Monday, kind of the RFC had presented two options side by side, selection based on fields, selection based on labels. The RFC now comes down firmly on one side, say selection based on fields. Based on the conversation yesterday, the syntax for doing that has been brought a little more in line with what we already have, where every resource continues to have a template ref. That template ref continues to have a kind, and then there's some key that will be a list. So you could either specify a name here, or you could specify some key for a list. As far as the syntax options from Rash's suggestion, and then a name is given for what's the name of the template that we are looking for, and then what is the what's the criteria for selecting this or this. Rash suggested that we adopt the match expressions syntax that is used on pods or on jobs and in Kubernetes. That gives us a key, which would be a path, and then there are 4 operators: exists, does not exist, in, and not in. And if you specify in or not in, then you additionally include an array of values that whatever is found at this on this field would need to match.
Sorry, one question.
Yes.
Is this syntax backwards compatible with what we already have? I remember seeing, so the Rash's proposal that is linked in here makes a point of saying that the syntax is backwards compatible. I just want to confirm, is that the case here?
I mean, the syntax for the template ref?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't see why not.
yeah, it is.
It seems to be right, yeah.
Yeah.
Because kind is still there, and then options is a new field which can enumerate multiple.
There will be a validation that says that if you provide options, you can't provide the name, and vice versa. Right? Washima? Makes sense.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does the RFC define what happens if neither of the options are matchable? Like the match fails for both options?
As if match fails for both options, then nothing's stamped out, and the
So we don't
supply chain
error,
could
we
start
just skip.
this does not define this does not define what to do if nothing matches, but there is a question about what should we do if too many things match. I have no objection to saying, oh, if nothing matches, then we should throw an error. I also, yeah, that'd be the closest error to throw. That would be the best approach.
I'm going to submit a further RFC that proposes determinism, right? But it doesn't have to land in this one. Is that what we're saying?
So I think that's definitely, I would be happy to see that. I did drop in a paragraph in here to say, like, I think determinism is desirable, and it's I'm still concerned that Cartographer may not we may not have that luxury. It may be that we find use cases that are very important that would require checking the output of some step in the supply chain, and based on that output, deciding what to do next. The 2 examples of that would be that I have in my head right now are, say there's a platform that wants to build a platform that wants to build and allow images to be built from source code. And sometimes the source code will bring it a Docker container. Right now, the open source tooling that we use, KPack, isn't aware of that, and so doesn't really handle that well. And my first pass at fixing that would be, well, run a Tecton pipeline to, or do your Canico thing. If Canico doesn't give healthy output, then the next step should be KPAC, otherwise it should be skipped. And go on to image scanning. That would be an example of non-determinism in the supply chain. Similarly,
Is there a reason we need to iron this out for this
Yeah,
RFC?
thanks. Yeah,
Can
I was trying to shortcut this discussion with Schumer.
sure.
I wasn't trying to start it, sorry.
Okay, it's
Yeah.
totally fair.
It's called out, which is great. It's called out in the bottom of this discussion. We can put it in our comments if we have comments.
Yeah.
I know that Rash, your proposal is not a formal RFC yet,
No.
but you do have a document. Is it worth comparing these two side by side and talking a bit about like the different syntax and stuff like that?
Well, we've tried to make the syntax in line so that mine would just be an extension of this. So mine is next steps, being able to switch on inputs as well. The only syntax difference I see in here, I will argue about, I think I can just do offline, which is that I don't think we should use the word match expressions for our extended version of matching on fields. It should be match fields, because I think we should still be able to use match expressions and match labels in this selector, and it should start with the word selector so that it looks exactly like selectors but extended. But I'm going to argue that offline. I think that's a minor point. But that's the only syntax difference between this and mine.
So how do we want to reason about this then? Because so then are we going to reason about multi-templates separate from the idea of, are we then comparing like Rash, your suggestion for matching inputs to the same way that snippets are defined in RFC 5? Are we going to like compare these as two different things, or should we think about this all holistically?
Let's decide on this RFC in isolation from snippets and inputs, because both Rash's suggestion and Washuma's agree on this baseline here in this RFC, and there's no reason to talk about snippets and inputs for this RFC to get approved.
Yeah, we've already decided that that would work, and we can continue with this holistic discussion about inputs and how inputs not invalidate, but elide the necessity to use snippets. I still think there's value in snippets, but that's a different thing for a different reason. And yeah, we just wanted to try and focus on what this brings, which is a step towards being able to select.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I have to go. I apologize.
Yeah, I want to call out two open choices. Should options be an ordered list? Previously, this RFC had talked about, had proposed fallback templates, and those were explicitly ordered. Of course, you define each option in an array. Arrays are ordered. And so that would allow, if we consider them as ordered, then that would allow tiebreakers. If two options are fulfillable, the earlier one in the list would be chosen. However, it may be at least surprising if we consider this not ordered and just say, if two match, then we throw an error. I have a slight preference for throwing an error, but I'm very open to the community voices that we might hear today. So make space for those.
+1 on erroring.
Yeah.
That's all I'll say.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, I heard Rash saying that he had some feedback on the syntax for matching fields. Previously, the RC used language that was close to what we use for observed conditions, where we specify a key and a value. One detriment there is that key and value don't capture this exists operation. and so we would have to introduce something like a star or wildcard. But we would have the advantage of having our selector, our field selector here, aligning with other selection that we do in Cartographer for different reasons. Separately, as I said, this idea of match expressions comes from Rash's the write-up that Rash did, and comes from Kubernetes spec. I think those are the, other than the, so yeah, I heard we're going with error if both match, error if neither match. So I'm happy to write that in. A syntax is proposed here, and I've heard already some thoughts on feedback. There's nothing else that I wanted to highlight, but I'll throw it open to the floor for any questions or comments.
I have a question about just comparing these two big options for whether we kind of base things on field selectors, or there's the alternative at the bottom that's based on labels and suggests a webhook. The examples in the RFC are pretty simple. That's like switching on whether there's a source image or source from a Git repository. But I worry that if you have a more complex supply chain that has like selectors based on whether there's a Tecton pipeline next to the workload, these it could be a lot of repetitive logic in supply chains, and that option 2 could with the webhook that kind of decouples that definition of the rules and makes it reusable across supply chains, right? Could kind of save us from some configuration sprawl. I'm not taking a strong opinion that we should do that necessarily. I just wonder if before we choose a path, if it's worth creating maybe a more complex example that covers some of the things that we know, that we'd like to kind of use the feature for, like the presence of a testing pipeline, right? Before we proceed to one implementation. That said, I also could see a path where we kind of do both of these things, because if you have match labels, and you could just say, yeah, you can put it in the supply chain embedded, or you could extract it into the inspector thing. So I think there's a path forward that says, yes, it's complex, but we're going to do it anyways because it's simple for now. And then we'll also add this other feature later if we want to that does the inspection. So it's not an either or. I just wanted to call out that there's, there may be this thing that pushes us more towards extracting that logic in the future, and wondered if it's worth kind of seeing what the syntax for more complex use cases, might look like earlier in the process.
Mm-hmm. I would say, yeah, as you kind of, one thing that I'd point out, labels are part of the workload metadata. So I argue that match expressions covers the use case of match label. One could also cogently argue, and I would not object to, match labels is part of the selector. Match labels sits next to match expression, so we could include that. I've not included it in the RFC, but if someone wanted to push that, I would not push back very hard. And I would also point out that match expressions is an array of conditions, so that does give us quite a bit of power. I think the one thing that you bring up, and I haven't been thinking in terms of this, but have been in terms of another one, is that question of what would be a good language to specify I want to inspect not only the workload but other objects on the cluster. that sounds like a plausible thing that we might want to do. And I suspect that I actually come down on the other side. I was hearing you say maybe that pushes us closer to labels. I suspect that because we won't know if something is, so that Tecton pipeline, if the Tecton pipeline already exists on the cluster, when the supply chain, when the workload is applied, then it's easy for a mutating webhook to say, let me search the cluster, let me see if this thing exists, let me apply a label. But if it goes in the other order, if the workload is applied first and then a pipeline, then you have to have a mutating webhook that knows that every time, that needs to be listening for pipelines being added to the cluster. And sure, we can do that, but what if it's not a pipeline? What if it's some other arbitrary object? So my expectation is that language, if we need it, will have to be here rather than in webhook.
That makes sense. You could also have a reconciler that adds the labels dynamically to the inspector after the thing is created, right? As long as the mutating webhook is willing to manage the fact that those labels aren't going to exist locally, you could, when the inspector is created, add more labels after the inspector is created based on the presence of the other object.
I will say, one, I'm not sure that we need to solve it now, but when we do solve it, I have questions for you.
I think if we feel like we're not trying to account for those use cases, right? Being able to match on the existence of another, like getting rid of, for instance, a test pipeline versus a no test pipeline, or supply chain. If we don't want to account for those use cases in this RFC and we want to defer that, I think that's okay. It's just, if we are planning to add more complex expressions, knowing about that ahead of time, might help us inform the design. But I don't think it's necessary if we're not planning to cover it here.
I heard Rash mention changing match expressions to match fields. That seems like a change in the spec that we should document if we're accepting or not, if we're not.
Yeah, I think he said that he was going to put a comment in, and yeah, I don't have I suppose one advantage to that is that if we want to drift from the syntax of match expressions, it's easier if we're not using the exact wording match expressions.
I think he also mentioned, like, if we add the selector later on, then match expressions would go under the selector. So it'd be weird to have it same level as selector and nested under selector.
Yeah, fair enough.
So we don't have an RFC process. So if we accept that change and we've answered the open questions because no one's argued anything other than what has been proposed, do we just vote on it now?
I think it probably makes sense to say, let's move this. I don't know if this PR is in a draft state or not at the moment.
I think the PR should be in a non-draft state, and it should be updated to reflect exactly what everybody's going to agree on, and then people should vote on it asynchronously, on GitHub, so we have a formal record of that. And also, we should figure out what the rules are around voting, but maybe we can figure that out after this RFC.
Yeah.
So there's an RFC to figure that out, but we can put this one in before that one gets merged. So.
Sorry, Sorry, I would like to
Mhm.
see the syntax for match expressions, or like whatever you. It's still not totally clear to me. Like I'm looking at Rash's thing and looking at this thing exactly what's being proposed to pull over. I think I don't have a super strong opinion about it, but just making sure the RFC has exactly what we want to move forward with. And just I am very supportive of moving as close to what the Kubernetes ecosystem does for these types of selectors, even if it's like a little different than what we did in other resources. It means let's fix it in the other places, move those forward too, right? I really like that. I feel like that's the direction that that seems like we're heading with this, was try to match what the ecosystem's doing. That seems like a good idea. I had another question actually about, I see name is kind of repeated in some of these conditionals. So it's like there's a name at the, like it's components, or it should be resources, and then name source provider, and then in the options there are additional names. Are those, I think it's the outer one is the name of the resource, and the inner one is the name of a reference of a instance of the cluster source template.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Like I think I can deduce that, but because there's like two name fields and there's an outer one and two are in the conditional, it's not. It doesn't feel like the outer one. It feels like they're all labels, as opposed, not in the Kubernetes sense, but like they're all labeling something, as opposed to like the inner ones are, references to something else, and the upper one is like a internal label that's being used in the supply chain. I don't have an alternative to it. It's just like when I first read it, I was like, oh, you're naming the inner ones. Oh, no, those are the references for the other things. So I don't know if it means like maybe the kind should travel with the options, especially if like we introduce kinds with compatible output, duck types in the future. Maybe, but I understand the value of saying no, they have to be exactly the same kind, because that keeps it very strict, right? And making sure that everything plugs in together.
The alternative is a lot of validation, right? Like we have to validate that the kinds that are selected have the same output.
I'm not suggesting a change. It's just my initial, when I just read this, it took me a second to, for it to click. I wanted to provide that feedback, take it or leave, if that makes sense.
Okay. We had a conversation that touched on that with snippets, that snippets essentially will need to be implicitly typed to output, for example, a source or an image. So yeah, at the moment, I would say that this is the most compatible, because here's a template ref. A template ref would be a kind and a name, and I'm not at all opposed to breaking that and saying, for example, let's get rid of template ref and instead say output type, and the output type is source, and then you say template name. But I think that we maybe can handle that separate from this RFC.
Yeah, sounds good. Just feedback.
Okay. I'm going to hand things back over to David, though. I don't know if Marty's or mine. The next RFC
Yours
is
is
Marty's or
next.
mine.
I think it's yours.
Yeah.
May as well just keep pushing through.
Yeah.
All right. There we
Agree.
go. Back to sharing screen.
Thank you.
Okay. Give me a second so we can. Yeah. So this is talking about artifacts, reporting. Essentially, we want to be able to establish provenance. Hey, I've got some output at the end of my supply chain. I want to know which commit resulted in this, or which intermediate stage in the process got me there. in order to allow such reasoning to be done, in order to allow tooling that could report that, we need to establish provenance. A couple of things. This builds off of RFC 14, and for the motivation and use case, I just kind of point back to that. The most recent discussion that we had there came up with this shape of what artifacts would be. We have a list of artifacts. Those artifacts are of type either source, image, or config. They would have a unique ID, which was just proposed. Let's take the SHA-256 of the order JSON of exposed values. That's pretty simple right now. Two of these, image and config, just have one value, image, config, whereas source has two, URL and revision. We would then expose those not as an ID, but not as a hash, but just as their base values. And we would report what was the object that emitted this artifact. One change that I have been spiking on this and haven't updated it in my spike because the spike started drawing in like other necessary precomponents. But one change I would suggest is, and this really comes from Josh, in our previous discussion, we considered the ID to be, like, for this artifact is really just the output itself. Josh has argued and has convinced me that really we should be including the resource that output, that created that output. And so the artifact that comes off of, for example, a source provider, let's say you have a Git repository, a Flux Git repository that outputs a URL and revision, that artifact is distinct from the next step, the source tester, some Tecton pipeline that tests that. The URL and revision are the same, but obviously the resource that they came off of is different, and we should be able to disambiguate between those as artifacts in the supply chain. I'd mentioned that, and then if all of that is accepted, implementation of this is fairly straightforward. And then the more complicated thing that we'll need another RFC for work that was proposed long ago is this from field, establishing, let's say you've got a KPAC image that is emitting an image. It's very easy to read off of this to say, oh yeah, here's that output. But associating that with what was the input of the previous step that led to this output requires some change in how Cartographer works, because at the moment we don't have enough to track that. But this RFC assumes that work will be done so that we can fill out this from field and nail down tying this ID to some, for example, from an image ID, we tie it to some previous source ID.
Quick question before you move on, if that's okay. Oh, I think you froze. Sorry. So I'm a little confused. The past is resources where this ID was an input and an output, right? Like a source tester.
Yeah,
I thought not, because ID is now going to include the provider or the tester as part of the ID. So how
yeah,
could it?
if I could make a ninja edit, I would take past out, just to reflect, as I said, Josh had,
I think we probably want to still nest it for clarity, right? The reference to the resource that it came from.
I'd be fine with that. It would make it not a list, and I would just argue that order JSON of all other none from fields. That this should be part of that. That this past needs to be part of that ID.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe I asked this differently than I should have. So you have a pipeline, you have a commit, or you have a supply chain. You have a commit that's going through these individual steps. Past is the last one where it was both an input and an output.
It has nothing to do with the fact that it was an input and an output. It's always an output, and it is always strictly from the resource that produced it. And so like you would get an artifact for the very first item in your graph, like your Git repository, your very first source thing. It doesn't take an input, right? But it produces an artifact. So you would have your artifact tied to that first resource. You would have a separate artifact for the next stage in your pipe and your supply chain. Say it was a source tester. You would have a second artifact that has the same URL and revision, right? It just points to a separate resource that produced it. Because it's like saying that it came from here, it was like then again validated by this next step in the supply chain. And then so every template that produces an output produces a unique artifact.
What's the value of separating? Is it just because it's easier to implement to separate those things in this tree? Or it's like to me the value of the artifact graph is to know this artifact turned into this artifact turned into this artifact, and then also maybe like if an artifact is passing through validation steps, knowing that it was validated, and then as a user, if this were maximally useful to me, it'd be like I find the commit and I have all the information. I know what stage does it pass validation for, and I know what it came from. What's the use of separating the same output of different steps into different and giving those different artifact IDs?
I'd say
then you
that
can actually it actually produces a chain for you, right? Whereas if you just say past, like you just have an array of things. You don't specifically know an order, and you don't even and it presupposes that all of these things happen one right after another. Right? I don't have an example of like another something that runs 3 source templates and then builds an image and then runs another and then uses that same artifact as like a source later on. But like
you're saying, it encodes the validation tree. It lets you understand the
yes,
the order of validation, a complex order of validations, a nonlinear order of validations. Is that got it?
Yeah.
And so we want to preserve that information, and then we want to calculate the like if we need to draw an artifact, if we need to draw a tree or provide information about an artifact, we need to calculate that later based on the data. Is that
yeah,
right? Okay. Maybe artifacts isn't the right term, because it's not a list of artifacts, then it's like a list of outputs, or like,
well, I mean, I kind of see, yeah, okay. I mean, sure. Yeah, we can call it either.
Not a huge thing. Okay, and so past is really just like,
It
or
came
like
from this resource.
right. And then so for now we're talking about from and deriving the conversion between artifacts. Is that something that's going to be deducible from the tree itself now? If you have every step accounted for, can you follow back through the tree and then look for the equivalent of revision of the things that led into the first step that generated it? Why is there what's the issue around from if we keep track of the whole tree?
We just
You
sorry,
know
which one
that
do you
the, I mean, you could look at the supply chain that you have at the moment and say, oh, I see this is an output of this step, and here's another output of, like, here's a bunch of outputs of the source provider, and here's a bunch of outputs from the image builder. But to associate those, you need this from field. This is the only thing that says this source or this image was built off of source X rather than source Y.
Is it that you want the resource to express that, like, this image was built from this commit as opposed to this other commit of input? Is that the thing? So you're just saying like there's missing information there. Could we consider all inputs into a resource to be, have created the thing, and then we could descope from this kind of conversation about this RFC, and so at least we could still draw an artifact graph that shows the relationships between digests and revisions and whatever. It's just going to be, it might say that like your CI repo input into your image build step is also a commit that led to the creation of an image.
Hold on, are you saying we don't need past and from?
I'm saying if you have, yes, I think, but maybe something a little more specific than that. I think I'm saying if you have this tree of every output, right, of every every resource, and every resource capital R, I don't know how you want to say that. If you capture every output, even if it's the same, and you capture all the connections between them, then you do kind of know the inputs that led to an output, because you can find when.
Hold on.
That, yeah.
Past is not a graph. Past itself is not a graph of all the resources. It is the single one resource that you took the output from.
Oh, that doesn't have the ID of the. You can't use, past doesn't have an ID that you could use to requery through the graph.
Correct. That's the job of the from field. Past is only meant
from
to say
is from this KPAC image, right? I got this image URL from this KPAC image object, and the reference to that KPAC image object is important because like we need to take that object spec into consideration when we want to hash the artifact, because if we get two different artifacts from two different underlying KPAC objects, they should be representative of two separate artifacts.
Got it. Okay, so past is literally just information about the resource. It doesn't contain any information about the inputs into that resource, and therefore you can't use this to form a graph of anything, sort of.
You can't use past to form a graph, correct? You need the from.
Okay, got it.
To form the graph.
Yeah, and so for from, you're trying to capture the inputs. Is there a reason in, I see ID and then, oh, I see. The reason there's no type there is because the SHAs are all going to be unique across all types. And so yeah, okay.
There's no,
that makes sense.
There's no type. It literally references the ID of other
nodes.
Artifacts.
Yeah, got it. And in the case of from, is the reason that from is difficult that we are still trying to figure out the right observed generation strategy for mapping inputs to outputs?
Yeah.
Cool. Got it. Thank you. Perfect.
All right, I'm going to capture those changes on the
Do it
fly.
live.
Yeah, doing it live. Yeah, and there's an example here that should be touched up as well, but otherwise that's the RFC. Are there other thoughts or questions?
This, yeah, can we talk about what Stephen just mentioned, where this necessitates the fact that we are strict about matching the spec to an observed generation?
Yes. So go into the backlog. We have where did it go?
Third one down at 9 p.m.
Oh yeah, there we go. So we've got this issue that has been hanging around for a while about matching. Yeah, so we take KPAC. KPAC. I want to submit a KPAC image. I submit it. Its observed generation will almost immediately be 1. I've submitted the object, and it when I read the status, it'll say, "Hey, I'm processing this thing. My condition is unknown. My last image is not yet filled, but I'm still generation 1." And then sometime later, it will succeed in that status will change. It will have succeeded, and it will still be generation 1, and last image will be filled, and the status will be happy. Let's imagine that even before that happens, I submit a new definition of the image. Well, almost immediately, KPAC will say, "Well, I'm generation 2. I'm totally reporting to you everything that I know about the spec that you've submitted. It's still in an unknown state. Last image still hasn't been filled, and at some point, those fields get filled, and observed generation will still remain 2. And at that point, it's impossible to reason about which spec is this image representing. And so in order to handle that, the strategy that's been proposed is let's not submit new specs to a resource until that resource has already finished processing, that it's already reached a succeeded state or failed state. I have a branch where I've taken 28 because this represents user-facing API change. There's a branch where I've started the RFC. It's mostly ready.
Just sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Really quickly before you move to the next thing, I want to be like, I think the logic there is covers a case almost exactly for how you'd be able to hold off on spec updates to understand a mapping between the two. I would be a little more specific. It's more like if you control the spec, then you can guarantee knowledge of the mapping, because you couldn't just, it's not just that you hold off on spec updates. You could make the decision to update spec very proactively and just give up on mapping, right? Anything based on the previous spec value. So there are 2 options you have, right? You can either always hold spec until there's a resolution, or you can say, I have a new spec update. I'm going to give up on creating any resolution about the previous thing for whatever reason, right? Never ended up anywhere useful. And then you could decide to update the spec and just know that you're not supposed to, pass the information along, if that makes sense. So you do have a little bit more control than just holding off on spec updates. I know it sounds like a technicality, but it's maybe something worth thinking about when you're thinking about, what the options you have for performance are.
Can we give?
Wait, I would argue that accepting this RFC and saying that we need a from ties our hands and says that we can't update. So I think I may, if you disagree, then I'd like you to take that again a little slower, because
I think I think once I articulate this well, it will be obvious, or this won't seem as interesting a thing, if that makes sense. It's like you could update spec proactively, right? As long as you're willing to, on the other end, definitely not promote anything forward until you know that the spec update has propagated fully through, right? You have the option of just saying, up, if the resource is in a bad state, throw it all away, and then you could move faster, but you might lose good outputs, right? If you wanted to, you control both
Yes.
sides.
that
Yeah.
That is fair. I think so I would say that yes, that is correct, but it presents a problem of the system getting choked by fast commits.
Correct. Yes, exactly.
If your commits come in faster than your image builds, you would never get an output.
Yep. Just wanted to say you have two levers you can pull there if you, as you're thinking about the implementation. Okay, sorry, didn't mean to derail. Cool.
No. And so there's this. I need to update this to RFC 20. And this isn't even in. I haven't put it in draft state yet, but the we're proposing is that we use observed completion, which has a succeeded field. Sorry, let me back up. That we use what's on deployment template currently. That we start from there. What those are observed completion and observed match. It's unclear to me that observed match would get leveraged at any point, so maybe we want to just keep it to observed completion. There are a couple of limitations. There are a couple of possible extensions that I list out here. I'm happy to talk about these now, or we can say, or to move on to things that are.
We're at time for this meeting as it is.
All I would say is very brief feedback is like, if there's a, I think the problem is there's conditions aren't very well standardized, and so oftentimes you really need to change it. But if there's a default we can use, like ready false, ready true, something like that, then that works across KPAC and some other things, right? That's common enough. It might be worth having a default value for that, so you don't have to repeat the same thing over and over again. But if that's not practical, then I think that's okay too.
I think that is fine as long as we don't come up against a some resource that somebody would want to coordinate where ready true was not didn't actually indicate success. If it could have ready true and it wasn't successful, then we'd be in trouble.
Yeah, I'm not saying I know that we should have the default. Just if it happens to be that we can have the default and it's safe, then we should consider having a default there. If that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's that. I think it's to that. I think it's probabilistic. Like, will we run into that case? I don't know. Like, how much risk do we want to take on for that? I'm a little risk averse, but I don't know.
Makes sense. I hear a lot of feedback that our templates are pretty complex already. So if we can make it more obvious to a user and it really is consistent enough, then it's something to think about.
Cool. Okay. Now thank you all again for your time. Yeah, it's a shame that we didn't have time to discuss the RFC process RFC, but hopefully we will be able to discuss that in the office hour session. So thank you all and see you next week. Bye.